Airport security rules leave little room for exceptions. Shoes off, laptops in the bin, pockets empty. For most travelers, it's routine. But when an 82-year-old veteran struggled at the checkpoint, his hands unsteady, cane wobbling as he tried to manage his belt and belongings, one TSA agent paused. The line behind him grew restless, but she noticed the quiet dignity in his movements and the military insignia on his worn jacket. Unbeknownst to her, the man had earned more medals than most soldiers see in a lifetime. In that moment, the question wasn't just about policy. It was about how we honor those who have served, especially when no one expects recognition. As the morning rush pressed forward, the airport's usual order began to shift. The security checkpoint at Denver International Airport was crowded, the morning rush funneling travelers into a single, slow-moving line. In the midst of the shuffle, an elderly man paused at the conveyor belt, his cane trembling as he tried to juggle his belongings and keep his balance. He wore a faded jacket with military insignia, and his hands steady once, now uncooperative, fumbled with the buckle of his belt. The process that most people handled without a thought seemed to multiply in complexity for him, each step a new obstacle. He struggled to undo the worn leather strap, missing the clasp more than once, before finally managing to slide it free. The people behind him shifted and sighed, the collective impatience of a long line compressed into the space between footsteps. A TSA agent repeated instructions about electronics and liquids, his tone clipped, eyes fixed on the monitor instead of the passengers. Sarah Kowalski, stationed near the conveyor, watched the veteran with a growing sense of unease. She noticed how he arranged his wallet and phone with careful precision in the plastic bin, shoes placed neatly together, as if order might help him retain a sense of control. But now, the same hands that had been so deliberate were failing him. Coins slipped from his grip and scattered across the floor, a silver dollar rolling to a stop against Sarah's shoe. Another agent, louder, reminded him to remove all metal objects. The veteran nodded, but his hands shook as he searched his jacket and pants, trying to remember what else he might have missed. The line behind him barely moved. A businessman 2 places back checked his watch, but Sarah's focus stayed on the veteran's face as his cheeks reddened with embarrassment. He crouched stiffly to retrieve the coins, his knee cracking audibly. The supervisor at the checkpoint made a quick note on his clipboard, eyes flicking to the growing line. When the veteran finally finished emptying his pockets, he realized too late that he'd left a small penknife on his keychain. The X-ray operator spotted it, and the order came. "Step to the side, please." Confusion flashed across the man's face. Before he understood, he was being pulled aside for additional screening. He reached for his cane as it teetered on the edge of the table, but it slipped, clattering to the floor. Sarah saw the sequence unfold, a cane falling, the veteran lurching forward, the supervisor reacting sharply, and other agents tensing as if expecting trouble. The veteran froze, one hand outstretched, caught between needing support and being wary of drawing more attention. Sarah's training told her to stay at her post, to let the process continue. But something about the rigid way the veteran stood, how he tried to mask his discomfort, reminded her of her grandfather's stories about coming home from Korea, how small indignities could linger long after the war. The supervisor began the standard pat-down, brisk and impersonal, while the veteran steadied himself against the table. Sarah noticed how his breathing grew shallow, and his fingers gripped the edge just a bit too tightly. Most travelers averted their eyes as the line inched forward, trying to ignore the discomfort of the scene. Sarah felt the tension building inside her, the push and pull between protocol and empathy. Her grandfather had always told her that respect was shown in the moments no one else noticed. She watched the veteran wince as the supervisor's hands pressed against his right knee, the fabric stretched over an old injury. That was enough. Sarah stepped out from behind her station, her decision made. Sarah crossed the short distance to the screening area, placing herself between the veteran and the supervisor with a quiet confidence that drew a few glances from the line. She kept her voice steady as she addressed the supervisor. "I'll take care of this." Not waiting for approval. She crouched to retrieve the cane, careful to return it handle. First, a small gesture she remembered from her father's lessons about respect. The veteran accepted the cane and met her eyes with a brief nod. Sarah recalled that agents were allowed to adapt screening procedures for travelers with mobility challenges, an allowance she rarely saw used. She helped the veteran with his shoes, noting the deliberate way he'd polished them, the lift in the left sole, the signs of a life lived with discipline and quiet endurance. "You can put your hand on my shoulder if you need to steady yourself," she offered, demonstrating the movement so he could follow without feeling exposed. His grip was light, shaky, but grateful. She summarized the standard procedure in a calm voice, skipping unnecessary steps and explaining each part before she began. "I'm going to check your left arm first," she said, moving slowly and giving him time to anticipate her touch. When her fingers traced the raised scar on his forearm, she simply paused and continued, making no comment. She adjusted her stance to shield him from the curious stares of other travelers, keeping her body between him and the line. The supervisor watched, silent but tense, as Sarah worked. At the right knee, she noticed the hard outline beneath the fabric and softened her touch, warning the veteran quietly. "This part can be uncomfortable." He didn't flinch, but his breathing changed, and she caught the briefest flicker of old pain in his eyes. She ignored the supervisor's muttered comment about special treatment and focused on the veteran's comfort, making sure each step was clear and respectful. When the belt triggered the scanner again, Sarah asked permission before running it through a second time. The veteran nodded, his eyes flicking toward the supervisor, who busied himself with his tie. "False positive," Sarah said, her tone final. She helped the veteran realign his pants and handed his belt back in a way that preserved his dignity, not just passing it across the table but holding it steady as he refastened it. She sorted through the loose change that had mixed with another passenger's coins, returning each piece without making him stretch or fumble. The process was slower than usual, but Sarah kept her movements deliberate, aware that the line was watching but refusing to rush. The veteran gathered his belongings with methodical care, pausing to ensure everything was in its place. He surrendered the small knife without protest, his expression unreadable. As he finished, Sarah caught a brief gesture, 2 fingers to his brow, not quite a salute, but an acknowledgement. He turned toward the terminal, posture straightening as he moved away from the checkpoint. The supervisor waited until the veteran was out of earshot, then spoke quietly. "We'll talk about this later," but his words lacked their usual edge. A woman in line handed Sarah her shoes and said, "My son served in Iraq," her tone soft but steady. The rest of the shift unfolded with routine efficiency, but the memory of the moment lingered. Sarah noticed coworkers glancing her way, a few passengers watching her with new attention. The airport's rhythm resumed: shoes off, laptops out, the usual instructions repeated, but beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted. As Sarah returned to her post, she had no idea how far the effects of her choice would reach. In the break room, the conversation shifted as soon as Sarah entered. Mark, one of the newer agents, looked up from his coffee and nodded in her direction. "That was the right call," he said, his tone quiet but certain. On the table, a single photocopied page from the TSA Manualtha section on disability accommodations sat between a half-eaten muffin and a stack of shift schedules. The discussion didn't linger on rules or reprimands. Instead, it circled around what it meant to notice someone's struggle and to respond with respect. Meanwhile, at Gate 17, the veteran settled into a seat with a direct view of the security checkpoint. He kept his carry-on close, hands folded neatly in his lap. Every so often, his gaze drifted back to the lines at security, tracking the agents as they moved through their routines. He didn't check the flight board or open his bag. Instead, he seemed to watch for something a moment, perhaps, or a sign that what had happened earlier was not just an exception, but the start of something different. On the other side of the terminal, the ripple began to spread in small, almost imperceptible ways. A woman in a gray pantsuit stopped at the supervisor's desk. She placed her boarding pass down with deliberate care and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "That agent who helped the gentleman earlier me. Husband's at Walter Reed right now." She didn't wait for a reply. gathering her things and moving on, but her words lingered in the air. In the administrative office, Assistant Director Cho paused over the morning's incident reports. She made a brief note in Sarah's file, then hesitated before dialing the Office of Professional Responsibility. The call was short, her voice measured as she recounted the morning's events, but the conversation left a question about how policy could be balanced with compassion. By the afternoon, the story had traveled through the checkpoint teams. Agents began to quietly point out older travelers to one another, a subtle shift in awareness. One trainee offered to help a Vietnam veteran with a knee brace, only to be reminded of standard procedure, but the gesture was noticed. In another lane, a sign with the ADA hotline number appeared in slightly larger print than before. The atmosphere at the checkpoint grew a little more attentive. The routine softened at the edges. The veteran remained at gate 17 longer than most, his eyes returning again and again to the security area. When his flight was finally called, he stood and dialed a number from memory, his voice low and steady as he relayed the checkpoint location. The gate agent, scanning boarding passes, noticed the old man's posture upright, composed, as if something important had been set right. Sarah finished her shift without knowing how the morning's events had echoed outward. She moved through the motions of the job, processing hundreds of travelers, her mind already turning to the next day. At her locker, she found a typed note referencing her deviation from protocol, the words slightly blurred by the copier. She read it once, then tucked it away. Elsewhere, in a quiet hotel conference room, a group of Marine officers gathered around a phone, their attention fixed on flight updates. They exchanged few words, each man focused on the details at hand. Their destination was clear, and their purpose silent but shared. Back at the terminal, the routines of airport life continued. Baggage handlers moved luggage, cleaning crews worked the floors, and the security line advanced with its familiar rhythm. But small changes had taken root: a new sign, a photocopied manual page, a shift in how agents watched the line. At the supervisor's station, a guide to military insignia was pinned next to the shift schedule, the laminate catching the overhead lights with every passing footstep. As the afternoon wore on, travelers and staff alike began to notice small groups forming near the security exit, a subtle concentration of attention that hinted at something about to unfold. The first Marine appeared just past the security exit at 3:22 p.m., his dress blues distinct against the stream of travelers. He paused near the information desk, posture easy but his gaze alert, waiting rather than passing through. Sarah noticed him during a bag check, registering the uniform but thinking little of it. Military presence was common here. But then another Marine appeared. Within minutes, a dozen stood quietly in the terminal, their gold buttons and polished shoes drawing glances from passengers. The group grew steadily. A dozen became several dozen, their formation loose but unmistakable, stretching along the walkway by the tram station. Travelers slowed, drawn by the sudden presence of so many in uniform. Some lifted phones for photos. A few children pointed, their parents whispering explanations. Sarah, midway through screening a stroller, sensed the shift in the terminal's mood. The usual background noise of rolling luggage, boarding announcements seemed to hush in a wave. She looked up, realizing that the Marines now formed a line that curved toward the security exit, their numbers far exceeding anything she'd seen before. Amid the growing crowd, Sarah spotted the elderly veteran from that morning. He moved with intention along the main concourse, cane in hand, but his step was different, now measured, dignified. His jacket bore insignia she couldn't name, and his shoulders were set with a confidence that made him appear years younger. The Marine's line straightened as he approached. At a crisp command, the entire formation snapped to attention. The sound of 40 pairs of heels, striking tile at once, cut through the terminal, and every conversation around them stopped. Sarah's heart thudded. She stood motionless, caught between her post and the scene unfolding just beyond the checkpoint. The sight of dozens of Marines saluting in unison sent a shiver up her spine. For a moment, she felt the weight of the morning's decision, her own small act of compassion, echoing back at her in a way she could never have predicted. She drew a breath, feeling both out of place and deeply honored, her hands still hovering over a tray of plastic bins. The veteran paused before the Marines, returning their salute with the same two-fingered gesture he'd given Sarah earlier, this time unmistakable in its meaning. The lead Marine broke formation and handed a note to a senior non-commissioned officer, who began making his way toward the security checkpoint. Sarah watched him approach, the crowd parting to let him through. She stayed at her post, uncertain if she should step forward, but the Marine stopped at the edge of the civilian area and waited for her to finish screening a family's car seat. "Ma'am," he said, voice clear but restrained. "Colonel Riggs requests the honor of your presence." He extended a folded note. Sarah took it, her fingertips brushing the white gloves. Inside, she found a name: Colonel James T. Riggs, USMC Ret, followed by a list of decorations and a brief message. "Your actions honored all who serve." She stared at the words, the reality settling in. Two Marines stepped forward with a small velvet box, presenting it to her with quiet ceremony. Inside was a challenge coin, its insignia matching the patch now visible on the colonel's sleeve. Sarah accepted it left-handed, her right hand unconsciously pressing against her TSA badge, unsure if she was meant to salute or simply stand still. The moment stretched, punctuated by camera flashes and the silence of travelers bearing witness. Noise gradually returned. Boarding announcements resumed, and the lines at security moved again. But Sarah's lane became a focal point as agents and passengers paused to watch. Her supervisor, who had questioned her earlier, quietly slid a disciplinary form back into his folder and stepped away. The Marines formed an honor cordon from the checkpoint to the United Club Lounge, their discipline and presence reshaping the atmosphere of the terminal. Sarah stood for a long moment, the challenge coin warm in her palm, aware that something significant had just taken place. As she returned to her post, she noticed a Marine captain waiting nearby, a folded document visible in his left pocket. The crowd's attention lingered on the security area, and Sarah sensed that the story behind this gathering was only beginning to unfold. The Marine captain approached Sarah with a folded document in his hand, a summary of Colonel James Riggs' military service. As the airport continued its daily routines, word spread about the man who'd needed help at security that morning. Details emerged gradually: 3 combat tours in Vietnam, 72 months as a prisoner of war. The scars Sarah had noticed earlier traced back to interrogations in a bamboo cage outside Da Nang, each mark a record of survival. Riggs's current ID listed him as the director of a veterans rehabilitation center in Virginia, but for the Marines assembled in the terminal, that title only hinted at his history. The gunnery sergeant at the end of the line remembered him as the officer who had dragged him through miles of jungle, using his own belt as a tourniquet. A young lieutenant recalled Riggs as the anonymous donor who funded his ROTC scholarship. Each Marine in the formation seemed to hold a different chapter of the colonel's story. Major Donovan, who had presented Sarah with the challenge coin, explained quietly how Riggs earned his first Purple Heart breaking both wrists during a POW camp escape to lead 5 junior Marines to safety. The prosthetic knee, Donovan added, was the result of refusing to give up another prisoner's name, the injury delivered by a guard's rifle butt. Riggs had also been awarded the Bronze Star for valor, though he rarely spoke of it. These honors, visible in their absence of display, shaped how the Marines viewed him. To his fellow veterans, Riggs' refusal to ask for accommodations at TSA checkpoints made sense. A corporal explained that Riggs insisted on experiencing public spaces just as any disabled veteran would: no uniform, no rank, no shortcuts. "He won't even use VA plates," the corporal said, tugging at his gloves. "Says if a 19-year-old with one leg can get through security, so can he." By mid-afternoon, reporters arrived, piecing together how the Marine network mobilized so quickly. One phone call from Riggs had set off a chain of messages, reaching 3 bases and drawing in Marines from a nearby reserve unit whose ceremony had ended early. The airport's public affairs team updated their statement twice, first noting respect for all travelers, then specifically commending Sarah's actions after reviewing security footage. Sarah, was soon escorted to a conference room, where Colonel Riggs waited with photographs spread across the table. The images showed him beside wounded veterans, signing documents at the rehab center, and saluting a young Marine in a hospital gown. Each photo revealed a different aspect of his life, his hands' tremor visible even as he guided others through recovery. A major overseeing media inquiries showed Sarah a recent photo of Riggs in the same polo shirt he'd worn that morning, this time helping a burn victim with therapy. "He never asks for help himself," she said, "because he wants to teach by example." Passengers and airport staff began to share their own stories. The businessman who had grumbled in line now remembered Riggs quietly letting others go ahead when his knee locked. The TSA supervisor, who'd questioned Sarah's approach, discovered his uncle had served under Riggs decades earlier. Even a janitor recalled seeing the colonel volunteering at a shelter for homeless veterans earlier in the week. By evening, national veteran organizations had learned of the incident. Messages from POW and Purple Heart groups arrived at airport administration. The Denver VA hospital offered to consult on disability training. A retired Air Force general posted about the event, prompting others to share stories of veterans declining special treatment. Sarah's scheduled disciplinary meeting shifted focus when Colonel Riggs produced a TSA accessibility pamphlet, annotated with notes about the gap between policy and practice. He spoke quietly about how small indignities at checkpoints discouraged disabled veterans from traveling. As the terminal lights reflected off the glass, Sarah noticed Riggs rubbing his knee when he thought no one was watching. A Marine public affairs officer confirmed, "He won't sit not while Marines are standing." Records later showed Riggs had passed through this checkpoint 17 times in 2 years, never using the assistance lane. Footage revealed him helping elderly travelers on previous visits, always moving on before anyone could thank him. When asked by a reporter why he accepted recognition now, Riggs nodded toward the Marines, and then at Sarah. "They earned it," he said. "She just needed to know." As the evening drew to a close, the focus began to shift from the events of the day to their implications for the people involved. Sarah's disciplinary meeting started on schedule in the TSA administration office, but the atmosphere was different than she'd expected. Assistant Director Cho opened her personnel file, flipping to the page reserved for warnings. Before she could continue, 3 fellow agents entered the room and sat quietly along the wall. One placed a stack of printed passenger commendations on the table, testimony collected from travelers who had witnessed the morning's events. The morning brought a steady stream of attention from outside the agency. Local media outlets reached out for statements about the Marines' presence in the terminal, and a reporter from the Marine Times requested an interview about challenge coin traditions. The real shift came when a courier delivered a formal letter from Colonel Riggs, written on Rehabilitation Center letterhead. The letter described in detail how Sarah's actions reflected the agency's stated values, and argued that her approach had done more for the agency's reputation than strict adherence to protocol ever could. As these developments unfolded, it became clear that Sarah's hearing was no longer just about one agent's conduct. The meeting shifted focus, evolving into a discussion about the agency's broader approach to travelers with disability, especially veterans. Instead of reviewing only the incident, the group began to examine TSA's guidelines for accommodating mobility issues. Colonel Riggs's Marine liaison joined the conversation, referencing the agency's own manual and pointing out sections rarely cited in day-to-day operations. 2 factors accelerated the change in tone. Security footage revealed that Sarah's screening of Colonel Riggs took less time than the standard secondary screening for passengers with mobility challenges. Passenger flow data showed that her method actually improved efficiency during the morning rush, preventing the bottlenecks that often occurred during complex screenings. By the end of the day, what began as a disciplinary review had transformed into a working group focused on policy reform. Supervisors who had been assigned to assess Sarah's actions now sat beside the Marine liaison, reviewing the agency's disability accommodation guidelines. The group studied a section of the manual about adapting procedures for hidden disabilities, a section most agents admitted they had never read closely. Management moved quickly. Within 48 hours, The airport announced several immediate changes: an optional veteran designation on boarding passes, to new visual markers for agents to discreetly identify travelers who might need extra assistance, and a simplified screening flowchart for elderly passengers. Sarah was asked to help draft new training materials, using her experience and Riggs's notes on veteran mobility needs. Colonel Riggs's influence became clear when airport operations revealed he had previously consulted with TSA headquarters about accessibility barriers. His earlier suggestions, such as colored lanyards for travelers needing extra time, were now fast-tracked for implementation. The review of Sarah's actions exposed gaps in veteran accommodations that extended beyond Denver, drawing interest from other airports and national organizations. Sarah's role changed rapidly. Within days, she was leading sessions for checkpoint supervisors on recognizing non-visible disabilities. The original disciplinary form remained in her file, but someone had added a note with the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, beside the incident description. Her training sessions now included Colonel Riggs's story, as a concrete example of when flexibility served both security and dignity. New guidelines appeared almost immediately. Agents received laminated quick reference cards listing veteran-specific screening considerations. Management authorized extra time for elderly passengers during peak hours. Most notably, TSA began testing a voluntary veteran identifier in Denver, with plans to evaluate its impact for possible expansion. Returning to her checkpoint, Sarah found a new placard at each X-ray machine. Not all disabilities are visible. The VA hotline and an internal supervisor extension appeared below. Agents who once hurried travelers through now paused to offer help, and passengers who had once grumbled at delays watched quietly as an agent assisted a Vietnam veteran with his shoes. When Sarah led her first training session, she used security footage of Riggs' screening as a teaching tool. Trainees noted how small adjustments improved both efficiency and respect. Supervisors counted multiple instances where her approach clarified best practices better than the manual. The final policy revisions included new sensitivity modules and a system for veterans to pre-register screening preferences. Colonel Riggs submitted a formal proposal for a commendation ribbon, recognizing agents who excel in serving disabled travelers. Management forwarded it to headquarters for review. As new procedures took hold, the checkpoint's routine changed. Agents and travelers alike began to notice the subtle effects lines moved more smoothly, and conversations about accommodation became more frequent. The story was no longer just about one agent or one passenger. It had become a catalyst for change, and the evidence of that shift was visible in the way people moved through the terminal each day. Security footage and passenger videos would soon bring the story to a wider audience, making it clear that the impact of a single moment could extend far beyond the checkpoint. Visibility changed everything. In the days following the incident, one passenger's vertical phone video became the focal point online. The clip, barely 15 seconds long, captured the tense exchange between the supervisor and Sarah at the checkpoint. The supervisor's voice carried, "We don't do special treatments." Sarah's reply, softer but unwavering, cut through the background noise. "He's earned it." The video spread quickly, gathering millions of views across platforms and drawing attention to the details of the moment: Sarah's steady posture, the veteran's visible discomfort, and the way the line behind them fell silent. News outlets picked up the story, using the viral video to anchor their coverage. Denver's local stations led with interviews from travelers who had witnessed both the screening and the Marines' salute later that afternoon. Their reporting focused less on ceremony and more on the ordinary: the veteran's weathered cane, Sarah's blue gloves, the hum of airport announcements continuing as the Marines formed their line. These details made the story accessible, grounding it in the everyday rather than the exceptional. National organizations took notice. The American Legion included the incident in a campaign about air travel anxiety among older veterans. The Wounded Warrior Project used the video in a training module for airport staff, emphasizing the importance of recognizing invisible wounds. By the end of the week, references to the incident appeared in disability policy briefs and advocacy newsletters. At the center of these discussions was Colonel Riggs's remark, "Dignity isn't special treatment," his words echoed through the coverage, reframing Sarah's actions as a model for respecting service without condescension. Social media platforms became a forum for debate. On Twitter, threads dissected TSA's lengthy disability policy against Sarah's brief, human-centered decision. Parenting groups on Facebook discussed whether flexibility in rules set a positive example for children. On LinkedIn, professionals highlighted the incident as evidence that compassionate leadership could exist even in the most procedural environments. The story's reach extended beyond aviation or veteran circles. It became a reference point for conversations about empathy and discretion in public service. At the airport, the effects of visibility were immediate. Travelers began to recognize Sarah in the terminal, sometimes requesting her lane or pausing to thank her. Supervisors fielded questions about the challenge coin she'd received, clarifying award display policies for staff. A Marine recruiter near baggage claim offered a salute as she passed. Colleagues reported a shift in break room conversations. Agents discussed strategies for quietly accommodating passengers, rather than venting about delays. Other airports responded quickly. The VA's regional office saw a surge in requests for courtesy screenings from veterans who had stopped flying. Seattle, Tacoma, and Dallas. Fort Worth. Each contacted Denver for details on their new visual markers and assistance protocols, with Dallas piloting its own version before Denver's evaluation had even concluded. The story became a benchmark, cited in industry discussions about balancing security with respect. Not all changes were official, and not all were dramatic. Subtle adjustments appeared throughout the terminal. Agents offering help with belts before being asked. Supervisors quietly modifying procedures for travelers with unsteady hands. New signage explaining assistance options without requiring passengers to self-identify. These were not sweeping reforms, but they represented a shift in our ANESA recognition that the small act of noticing could be as impactful as any formal policy. Months later, Colonel Riggs returned to the airport, this time accompanied by several patients from his rehabilitation center. None wore military insignia, and none announced their status. They observed quietly as agents interacted with travelers, noting the changed atmosphere. It was clear that the lesson of those 7 seconds at the checkpoint had taken root. The power of visibility lay not just in the reach of a viral video, but in the way it prompted ordinary people to look closer, to recognize dignity in the details of daily life. With the story now woven into the fabric of airport culture, the next steps came quickly. The agency began to examine its own procedures, looking for ways to translate this new awareness into lasting change. Change began with 3 main shifts in how the agency approached airport security for veterans and travelers with disabilities. The first centered on screening adaptations. Training modules were overhauled to include real footage from the Denver incident, focusing on subtle, practical ways to adjust procedures for passengers with prosthetics, PTSD, or limited mobility. Instead of relying on textbook scenarios, trainees watched time-stamped examples showing how small changes like offering a steadying hand or explaining each step could reduce anxiety without compromising safety. Exercises had agents simulate mobility or sensory challenges, helping them recognize the difference between compliance and genuine understanding. The second change addressed veteran self-identification. Online check-in systems at several major hubs now offered an optional field for service members to discreetly indicate their status. At the airport, physical markers evolved from conspicuous lanyards to small magnetic tags that triggered a silent alert at screening, invisible to other travelers. The design borrowed from airline frequent flyer technology, using encrypted codes to protect privacy. Agents saw only what they needed to assist, a quiet prompt to allow more time or offer verbal guidance, not a full disclosure of medical history. The third shift redefined employee recognition. Previously, awards focused on catching prohibited items or maintaining throughput. Now, commendations highlighted agents who demonstrated exceptional care for passengers. Sarah's challenge coin from Colonel Riggs became a template for new awards that linked security diligence with compassionate service. Stories of agents helping travelers with autism or responding thoughtfully to trauma cues began to circulate in briefings and newsletters. These examples set a new standard, encouraging staff to see flexibility as a strength rather than a liability. Streamlining assistance requests became another priority. The agency launched a secure online portal where travelers could pre-register needs, generating a simple QR code for checkpoint staff to scan. This system minimized awkward explanations at the gate and ensured consistency across participating airports. Agents received only essential prompts enough to adapt their approach, but never more than the traveler wished to share. The result was a noticeable drop in complaints about embarrassing or invasive questioning. Veteran sensitivity training spread quickly. Several major airports adopted the pilot program, integrating it into onboarding for all new hires. Feedback from agents suggested the practical simulations wearing joint braces, using earplugs, or navigating the checkpoint with a can made a lasting impression. Morale improved in teams where peer recognition became routine. Agents with military family ties reported feeling a new sense of pride in their work, seeing it as an extension of their own values. Sarah's role evolved as well. Promoted to training coordinator, she revised the disability section of the handbook, insisting that real-world adaptations be included alongside policy. The original disciplinary notice remained in her file at her request, a reminder that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. New hires reviewed her screening footage as part of their orientation, learning to spot the quiet details that matter most. Colonel Riggs joined as an advisor to the agency's veteran programs. He focused on practical solutions like armrest extensions for prosthetic users and simplified signature rather than symbolic gestures. He declined payment, asking only for regular updates on progress. Staff recognized him when he traveled, not by his medals, but by the veteran assistance brochures he reviewed in waiting areas. Complaint data showed the effect. Veteran-related grievances dropped noticeably, especially those involving humiliation or misunderstandings at checkpoints. Incidents involving service animals also declined after new identification protocols were introduced. Employee surveys revealed higher morale and confidence in assisting travelers with less visible needs. Retention improved, particularly among agents with personal connections to military service. Denver's checkpoint became a demonstration site for the new approach. Visitors observed agents offering discreet help, supervisors adjusting staffing based on who was traveling, not just how many. The lane where Sarah had helped Colonel Riggs now bore a small plaque, marking the origins of the agency's Veteran Assistance Initiative. New hires completed part of their training there, seeing firsthand how policy could adapt to real human needs. The reach of these changes went beyond airports. Airlines began piloting similar pre-screening systems for passengers with hidden disabilities. VA hospitals used footage from the Denver incident to prepare veterans for air travel. Even cruise lines reached out for advice on adapting security for returning service members. An independent review 6 months later found that screenings took, on average, just over a second longer, but repeat checks had dropped significantly. The biggest gains came during peak hours, as reduced anxiety led to smoother processing and fewer delays. In the months that followed, these changes became visible in the everyday flow of travel. Small gestures, an agent pausing to offer help, a traveler quietly showing a veteran ID began to accumulate, shaping a new standard for respect and efficiency at the checkpoint. Months after the changes began, the effects at Denver Airport's North Checkpoint are visible in the smallest routines. Agents glance at more than just boarding passes. They notice the subtle cues that mark a veteran or someone who might need extra time. The new self-identification system allows travelers to quietly signal for assistance, and Sarah often observes junior agents using the techniques she demonstrated that morning, standing between a passenger and the line, explaining each step and moving with a kind of practiced calm that puts people at ease. Sarah and Colonel Riggs maintain a steady collaboration, trading insights over monthly calls. Riggs remains direct, offering feedback from the perspective of someone who has lived through the system's blind spots. He reminds Sarah to focus on practicalities, Train agents to recognize mobility aids before they see the scars, and always warn before the scanner sounds. Sarah brings these lessons to her training sessions, sometimes having agents simulate travel with joint braces or earplugs to understand the physical and sensory challenges firsthand. Veteran organizations frequently invite Sarah to share her experience, but she keeps her talks grounded in the reality of daily operations. She points to specific outcomes like how a small change in signage cut confusion for elderly travelers, or how certain materials in prosthetics interact with detectors. At a recent conference, she walked attendees through a reenactment of the original screening, using side-by-side comparisons to show that the adapted approach, far from slowing things down, actually improved efficiency. Policy reforms now reach dozens of major airports. Atlanta, for example, adopted Denver's QR code system, streamlining accommodations for travelers who need them. This means a veteran flying from Boston to San Diego can expect a consistent experience, rather than facing unpredictable treatment at each stop. The spread of these practices is steady but measured enough to create momentum without overwhelming the process with numbers. Sarah reflects on these changes during quiet moments at the training center. The old disciplinary notice remains in her file, a silent reminder that the rules are not the end point, but a place to begin. She keeps Colonel Riggs' note pinned above her desk, the words visible to every trainee: "Your actions honored all who serve." The note is not a trophy, but a touchstone, grounding her work in the values that started the shift. Riggs' own life has changed as well. Medical reports show improved mobility, a result of his willingness to use the new assistance options rather than avoiding travel altogether. He speaks more openly about his experiences, mentoring younger veterans on navigating public spaces with confidence. Veteran-focused outlets continue to follow his story, not to celebrate a single dramatic moment, but to illustrate the ongoing impact of small, practical changes. The influence of these reforms now extends beyond airports. Shopping centers have adopted similar identification systems for security staff. Sports venues train their teams to recognize service indicators and respond quietly. A national hotel chain has incorporated TSA-inspired protocols into its guest assistance program after veterans reported smoother travel through Denver. These adaptations are not about creating special privileges, but about ensuring equal access public spaces that meet the needs of all citizens, without requiring anyone to ask for exceptions. At the checkpoint where everything began, reminders of the shift are woven into daily life. The lane where Sarah assisted Colonel Riggs now sees a steady flow of veterans, and agents keep a laminated photo of the Marine formation as a reminder of what respectful service can mean. New signage explains assistance options in plain language, and a discreet button at the station allows passengers to request help without drawing attention. Most travelers pass through without noticing, but for those who do pause, the changes are clear in the way agents move and speak. The real impact is felt in ordinary exchanges. An agent offering extra time to someone with unsteady hands, a supervisor adjusting a procedure without fanfare, a veteran approaching security with quiet assurance. These moments do not attract headlines, but they fulfill the hope that began with a single act of respect, creating a space where dignity is the standard, not the exception. As these changes settle into routine, the story's significance becomes clearer. The lessons from that morning at Denver Airport continue to shape how agents, travelers, and institutions approach every interaction. The next chapter begins not with a dramatic gesture, but with the recognition that one moment of connection can reshape entire systems. At the end of the year, Sarah and Colonel Riggs stood quietly at the checkpoint where their paths first crossed. Around them, agents worked with a calm confidence, applying the protocols inspired by that morning's encounter. The colonel's cane rested on his arm, the same one Sarah had steadied months before. They exchanged a brief look, no words, no ceremony, just a shared understanding of the dignity now woven into daily routine. Their story is a reminder that respect, shown in small moments, can set lasting standards. If you've witnessed everyday acts of honor for veterans, share them in the comments below and help keep these stories visible.